I've never been there, and I've been to many capital cities in the world, also in the States, but I've never been to Paris, even if it's so close to Italy.
Andrea is rather hesitant at first in part 2. Try to sound fluent from the very start.
I know that. No, sorry.
Andrea seems unsure of what he wants to say. You should always use your notes to help you.
I have many friends, many from France and especially from Paris, because every year in England I meet different kinds of people coming from different countries, and most of them are French. So every year I think that I'd really like to go there, also to visit, to go and see them, you know, and also to visit the place. It's very famous for museums and monuments, and I'm really interested in modern art and music. So I'd really love to go, also because I think that everybody needs to have a general culture on other cities, other countries. So I think that Paris is a place that almost everybody has to visit. I'd really like also French kitchen.
Andrea rushes his words and then hesitates. Try to speak at an even pace if you can.
So nouvelle cuisine and all that kind of stuff. I think I'd really enjoy it. I'll go there by plane, surely. I think it's much more comfortable than going there by train.
Andrea moves on to a different aspect of the topic without using discourse markers. It's a good idea to make use of words like first of all and lastly to organise your talk.
And
okay, thank you. And who would you go to that place with?
I think with my parents or with friends maybe. No idea. It's the same for me.
Okay, thank you. Can I take these, please?
This is yours.
Thanks. Okay, well, you've spoken about a place in another part of the world that you would love to visit in the future. So now let's discuss some related subjects. Can people learn more about geography from TV than they can from books?
It depends. It depends from the kind of books, and it depends on the TV programs. Of course, if you watch, for example, National Geographic frequently, you will learn a lot of information about different places, maybe unknown places. Reading books also is very useful.
Andrea answers these questions well. Try to give full answers whenever you can.
Do you think TV programs about different places encourage people to travel themselves?
It depends.
Andrea's starting to smile and look more relaxed. If you feel relaxed, you're more likely to do better.
It depends of what kind of places, what kind of people follow that kind of these programs. I think, yeah, generally I think it's true.
Well, now let's talk about visiting other countries. For what reasons do you think international travel has increased in recent years?
I think more culture, less ignorance. So people desire to see more places and so on. And also maybe it's easier to travel because you have low-cost flights and you can take trains from everywhere, planes from everywhere, and also most of people can pay a holiday in a foreign country.
Some people say it's important for people to find out about another country before they visit it. Do you agree?
Yes, I do. I do. I think that finding out some general information about a country you are visiting, for example, the culture, how is better to be dressed, for example, if you go in different countries, I think is very important. Yeah.
How useful is it for people to understand the language of the countries they visit?
It's quite important, you know, if you are, if you find yourself in an emergency situation, it's important to know basic vocabulary and so on, you know, just about maybe hospitals and hotels.
Okay, now let's consider the tourism industry. Does tourism play a big part in the economy of your country?
I don't think so. Italy is not so loved by tourists. There are just a few parts of it, like Toscana and Sardinia, and some cities like the capital city, Rome, and then Venezia, Firenze, which are very crowded and very visited by tourists in I think all the periods of the year. But tourism doesn't play an important part in our economy, especially in the economy of my city.
Andrea could give more examples to explain his answer and show off his range of vocabulary. You should take every opportunity to show that you can use a range of vocabulary.
What kinds of unpredictable factor can have a negative effect on the tourism industry?
I'm sorry?
What kinds of unpredictable factor can have a negative effect on the tourism industry?
What do you mean by unpredictable factor?
Andrea doesn't understand something in the question and asks for clarification, which is the right thing to do. You should always ask for clarification if you're not sure what the question is.
Well, an example might be bad weather, something that we can't predict.
All right. Bad weather is one. Dangerous conditions, for example, earthquake or storms, something like that, and also epidemics, particular kind of illness, and
Andrea has difficulty with vocabulary here. If you're not sure about the word, you should try paraphrasing it.
But I think tourism depends mainly on the kind of place you visit.
In the future, what kinds of development might there be in the tourism industry?
I think it's going to be much developed also because of cheap prices. You can have cheaper and cheaper flights, and so moving from a country to another is getting easier and easier. And I don't know very much about tourism.
Andrea has difficulty answering the question and explains why. This is the best thing to do in this situation.
Okay, thank you. That's the end of the test.
All right.
I think Fahad seemed very well prepared. He knew the procedures of the exam. In part one, he answered the questions well and gave full answers, giving reasons for what he said. In part two, he prepared his notes, and I did notice that he took his notes in Arabic, so it might be good to get himself thinking in English more by doing his notes in English. When he spoke quite well. He managed to develop things and say things, but he did dry up before the end of the 2 minutes, so it's good to use the planning stage to ensure that doesn't happen and to try to keep going if possible. In part three, he coped with the earlier questions, but when they got more complex, he seemed to have more difficulty, and that's something he could practice more, is dealing with more searching questions. I think Fahad followed instructions clearly. He didn't have any problems. He seemed to know what to do throughout the test, as far as I could see. One thing I could say that he could do, though, is he didn't understand one of the questions properly, I think. And it's fine to ask a question, ask for clarification, ask for an example. The main task Fahad was set was to talk for 2 minutes, and he prepared for that. He needed to perhaps spend a bit more time thinking about what he was going to say, taking notes, because he dried up a bit during the task, and it's better to keep going for the full 2 minutes. During the test, he used some accurate grammar, but he did make some simple mistakes. What are considered simple mistakes are things like final S on the third person, or plural final S, or missing articles like and the. Sometimes he made those kinds of mistakes, which are quite common mistakes. Fahad's performance overall was generally satisfactory. He was able to answer questions and deal with all the tasks, apart from the later, more demanding stages of Part 3. His vocabulary seemed to be adequate to answer many of the questions, although he wasn't able to go further than that. His grammar was limited but adequate for the tasks, and his pronunciation was clear and intelligible on the whole. There were some words he had a little difficulty pronouncing. He could work a bit more on stress and intonation in order to put a bit more feeling into his voice so that it doesn't sound too monotonous. But I would say that generally he didn't have a great deal of hesitation, so his fluency and coherence were quite nice. If I had wanted to improve his performance, many of the things you can do take a bit of time, like getting the grammar more accurate or the pronunciation more with a bit more stress and intonation, but certainly it's always worth working on those. You can, if you work on it, make some significant developments. Other than that, keep stretching himself in terms of vocabulary, spending time with people speaking English, so he's constantly pushing himself to have more of a repertoire, to create more ease of expression, and practice the exam procedures so that he doesn't dry up in Part 2, so that he feels confident to answer more complex questions in Part 3. I felt Andrea seemed very well prepared for the exam. He knew what to do and he followed instructions very clearly. In Part 2, when he had to talk for 2 minutes, he responded very well to the task. He was able to talk well for 2 minutes. He used his notes effectively. He used all the prompts on the card well, and he didn't dry up. He expanded and developed what he needed to say. So he performed well in Part 2. In terms of an overall performance, it was a strong performance. In terms of fluency and coherence, he seemed to respond well to the questions, to be able to talk without great hesitation. One of the factors in fluency is repetition and hesitation, and he did go a bit. And sometimes you can use pause more effectively instead of going So he should perhaps think about not being afraid to pause. In terms of pronunciation, that also the factor can come in on pronunciation because it makes it sound a bit staccato in a way, but that's another area that most people can work on, is stress and intonation if they want to get more native speaker-like in their delivery. The Italian pronunciation is more even, and English pronunciation uses stress in a very different way. when it comes to grammar, he showed quite a good range of grammar, certainly, and used it accurately. There's always room for more range to show the examiner that you've got a wide range and can use it accurately. And the same goes for lexical resource, where he generally was able to say what he wanted, express himself, paraphrase, and deliver good answers to questions. He got into a bit more trouble towards the end when the questions get more demanding. For example, he stumbled over words like earthquake and epidemic, which are perhaps less common words. But he certainly had the ability to express himself satisfactorily on most topics. I would say the most important areas to work on are showing off his range and accuracy in terms of grammar and vocabulary. I think he may have had more than he delivered, and it's always good to show what you can do. He could work a bit on stress and intonation. That's always a good area to improve on.
The most difficult part, I found it the last one, because you have to have a good vocabulary, a range of vocabulary, yeah, to understand the question. And I found it, for me, it's quite difficult. I think part one, I found it easier because it's a normal question and everybody can answer. Like, what's your name? And it's easy, I think.
I find difficult the third part and maybe the second part of the IELTS exam, because you have to talk about topics which are new to you and you don't know anything about them. So but you just have to talk, even if you're anxious, if you don't know anything, you just have to talk. The easiest part of the exam is talking about yourself and your family and your country, because you're so used to talking about it that it's nothing new to you. So I think is the easiest part.
The purpose of the IELTS exam is to assess the English of candidates and to see if their English is of the right level to do certain things. There are two forms of the exam, or two versions, the academic version and the general training version. People taking the academic version are generally taking it in order to show that their English is good enough for higher education, university, college, in an English-speaking context. And the general training version is normally taken by people generally for immigration purposes, if they want to immigrate to an English-speaking country, to show that their English is good enough. The IELTS exam is not a pass or fail exam like many exams. Instead, the candidates get a score or band which is between 1 and 9, and 9 is the highest band they could get. For example, in the speaking test, to get a band 6 or 7, they would have to show that they had got a satisfactory level in 4 different areas, and those are pronunciation, which is how naturally, how intelligibly they speak; fluency and coherence, which is how easily and fluently they speak and how easy it is to follow what they're saying; grammatical range and accuracy, which is how accurate their grammar is, but also how much range they show. And then lexical resource is also how much vocabulary they use, but also what range they use, and how accurately they use the right vocabulary to express what they want to say, and also to paraphrase if they don't know how to say something. Well, first of all, when the exam starts, the examiner will introduce the recording because the exam is recorded. And then part 1 will consist of about 4 to 5 minutes of questions, all related in some way to personal circumstances of the candidate, nothing unfamiliar. So, for example, they might talk about where they live, or they might talk about their work or their studies. And then there'll be some more questions about other familiar things, you know, for example, television or going out, free time, common topics that people are familiar with talking about. The examiner throughout the test is assessing the fluency, coherence, pronunciation, etc. But in part 1, they'll also have the idea that the candidate is on familiar territory. No final marks would be given at all. It would purely be the examiner getting a feel of how well they speak English. And often this is the stage where they get a feel of the pronunciation of the candidate, actually, because that's one of the first things you notice. So it's good for the candidates to show off their pronunciation, speak clearly from the very start. For part 1 of the test, the best thing for students to do to prepare for it is to practice talking about familiar topics, and so that they feel confident with talking about those things, and they feel that they do know the vocabulary, for example, that they're going to need to talk about those things. As far as pronunciation's concerned, it's good to be sure that you're confident of the pronunciation, or have checked that you pronounce the words that you would often use. So if you enjoy watching thriller movies, you can say thriller confidently and not suddenly think in the exam, how do I pronounce this? Also, be prepared to talk using a range of tenses. The examiner will probably ask you something about the past, the present, the future. So feel confident with a range of tenses, and generally just feel confident and relaxed with things that you probably know what to talk about anyway. You often talk about these things with people. In part 2 of the exam, the examiner will give the candidate a card with a task on it, and this is to talk for up to 2 minutes about a subject. The card will not just say talk about this, it will give some bullet points with particular aspects to talk about. The candidate will have 1 minute to prepare for this, and they can make notes. They'll be given a paper and pencil in the exam. They don't have to bring their own. And then they talk for 2 minutes as naturally as they can. In part 2 of the examiner is looking to hear a stretch of speech from the candidate, really, for 2 minutes. And the card and the bullet points are there to help, rather than you must fulfill all the bullet points. It's more that you can speak naturally about this subject, keep on topic, not go off topic, but develop and expand what you want to say for about 2 minutes. If students want to prepare for part 2 of the exam, it's good to be very familiar with what to do and to practice using exam practice material, for example, and making the notes, using all the bullet points. It's important to try and use all the bullet points so that you can be sure you won't dry up and you'll be able to talk for the full 2 minutes, and then be practiced in talking for a full 2 minutes so that you feel familiar with what that feels like. And then when you're actually speaking, try to use connecting words and expressions. Practice using things like that's why, this is because, and so but, connecting what you say and sequencing what you say. In part 3 of the exam, which lasts about 4 to 5 minutes, the candidate will be expected to answer questions on issues related to the topic that they talked about in part 2. The difference between part 2 and part 3 is that in part 2, for example, they'll have talked about something that's more personal, a personal experience, something like a meal they enjoyed. And then in part 3, that topic, a meal, would be developed in a more abstract way giving their opinions, but not talking about their personal experiences on issues related to things connected with meals. So that could go to food, issues related to food, things like that, but more complex or more demanding sides of that topic. In part 3, the examiner is looking to see how well the candidate can answer more probing questions, more in-depth questions, where the candidate is not talking about familiar and personal experiences, but talking about more abstract, complex subjects. They're looking to see now if their fluency and coherence are maintained, or their range of grammar or vocabulary is maintained at this more demanding level. If students want to prepare for part 3, then it's important to practice answering questions that require you to give your opinion and to explain what you mean about things. Obviously, you can do plenty of practice for this using practice materials. And also to feel confident when doing this, not that it's something strange doing it in a foreign language. They need to practice using the language of comparing, contrasting, or explaining what they mean. And in my opinion, personally, I think, expressions like that. And that's really the main things that they can do. Also, another useful tip is perhaps to give themselves thinking time. So they get asked a difficult question and they have something to say like, let me think, or I haven't thought about that before, just to give themselves a short pause to